coordinating domestic and international bodies for policies that improve resilience to biothreats. Yeah, please join me in welcoming Jasmin at this talk.
Thanks so much, Franchek. Hi, everyone. It is great to be here. Really, today's talk is structured about kind of mapping this map and convergence between different cause areas. And when it comes to enacting policy change, what are some triggers or things that we learned sort of over the past few months, trying a different playbook for policy change that we felt were particularly helpful, that we think could serve as sort of useful lessons for other people who are interested in kind of bringing about the same change. And I think the focus of this talk, given my career, is like, this is related to policy or health policy. But I think a lot of the systems I'm going to be touching on here today are really like broader than that. It doesn't matter if you're thinking about policy. If you're broadly thinking about, hey, there's a solution I want to exist in the world, how do I get there, and what are some tools I can deploy or research? So really the talk is structured at that level. A quick intro to kind of like my background for this. So I help lead our advocacy efforts in the UK for One Day Sooner. I am a biochemist by background, kind of started my research career, really enjoyed the science, like hated being in the lab, and I was like, this is not for me. And then I was like, maybe I should give industry a shot. Maybe the science in industry would be different. And the science at scale was amazing, got involved in some really, really cool projects and really interesting science. But again, I was like, oh, I don't want to be in the lab. And that's kind of where I fell into starting an organization about 2 years ago related to pandemic preparedness and policy, which was just like a really eye-opener on how powerful movements can be, even if you're starting as like a small project that just popped up that nobody's ever heard of. And that was really exciting, which kind of directed my next steps and kind of like what I'm up to these days. So there's some context in kind of my work, having done a little bit of a landscape between academia, research, industry, and now kind of policy, which has its advantages, I would say, in certain scenarios when you're kind of signaling credibility with certain government stakeholders and kind of how open they are to engaging in scientific conversations with you. And as I was saying, kind of really echoing the structure for this talk is starting out at this focus zone, what is the problem that you want to save in the world? And I'm trying to kind of give as more concrete examples as I can. So I've framed this talk in the structure of the problem set that I'm working on, which is related to human challenge trials. I'll give a quick synopsis of what they actually involve in a bit. Then the next step really is understanding, outside of what you think you know, what you've read or what you heard, what is the reality of the situation actually is for the people and the decision makers who are in charge of the solution. And really this involves like doing an analysis at sort of like 3 levels, I think. And sort of the last part of this talk is looking at, okay, so you have the solution that you want to aim for, you know which stakeholders and decision makers are involved and what they think, and then how do you get them to change their mind? So we'll follow that kind of structure as we go along. I think the first framing for this talk really is that usually when someone is excited to start a project or organization or a career step, they are hopefully usually passionate about a solution that they think should exist in this world. And the idea is this solution will significantly improve the outcomes for everybody or most people that the situation kind of touches or they're part of. And for us, I think the solution here is a very long sentence that I've written here, which is the idea that mechanisms like human challenge trials are really utilized as a way for how we think and prepare for future pandemics. And these come in sort of like 2 set cases. So one is this like current peacetime, I would say, that we're in. Well, at least for first world countries, I would say, where we're in this inter-pandemic phase where we've learned some lessons and have some energy that we want to put into for how we prepare for future outbreaks. And really, this is like a great ground for us to build some really sustainable structures when it comes to biothreats and pandemic preparedness. And then the second is that, okay, if we made these initial investments, how do we pivot these structures and these research platforms for when there is an actual outbreak, and then how do we deal with it? The idea here is like, we don't want a pandemic. That's what we really want to avoid. And human challenge trials is a mechanism that our team and organization and the work we do, we think it could be a really, really valuable asset. Just kind of touching on human challenge trials actually are. This is a very, very sort of like broad overview of how the clinical trial system actually works. So you have your phase 1 studies, which is kind of like verifying that this drug or vaccine that you're testing is actually safe to test in humans. This is your absolute sort of like baseline safety test that you have to perform. Afterwards, you move on to bigger trials, so phase 2 or phase 3, and this is where you're verifying that the vaccine is essentially doing what it's supposed to do, like it's causing the immunity that you want it to cause. And then your level 4 here, or phase 4, is kind of like an ongoing process where the vaccine or the drug is approved, it's on the market, and there's kind of like this continuous recycling of its pipeline by industry or like regulators, making sure there's like no side effects, the drug is still working, and what kind of like a 2.0 version of this could be. And this is like a really time-consuming and like a really, really expensive process. Like, I think I don't need to kind of like go on about how long it takes to make a vaccine and how quickly we made one for COVID. I think that's really apparent. But as you kind of go up the pipeline, this process gets really expensive. And what human challenge studies essentially are, sort of like between your phase 1 and phase 2, they're a trial where you deliberately infect human individuals, and it allows you to perform the study in very controlled environments than you otherwise would in a field trial. So some of the real big advantages of doing a human challenge trial here is that you're able to get a whole like colorful range of data that you just otherwise would not from your typical clinical trial. And I think another point that often gets missed is that the COVID vaccines that are currently on the market or in distribution, they're really symptom reducing. And what we need or should be aiming for is transmission blocking. You can't really effectively study mucosal immunity, or how do you block transmission from getting the disease in the first place without a human challenge trial, which is really important for what our solutions or countermeasures look like going forward. This is just sort of like a quick summary. I won't go through all of these, but just kind of echoing what I mentioned here is kind of all the factors that you're able to elicit from doing a human challenge trial, ranging from kind of like reducing the portfolio of candidates or vaccines you're working with, making them more streamlined, and kind of like enabling this day zero monitoring. So in a field trial, you would not know when a person has become infected because you give them the vaccine, you kind of let them out into the world, and you hope at the point at which they've gone infected, they will be able to report their symptoms, and you can kind of study how the disease is progressing in response to the vaccine. But in a human challenge trial, because you've infected them deliberately, you know exactly the date and the time point at which this was done, and you can monitor the response from sort of like time zero, which is like a really valuable science. And I think like when people talk about human challenge trials, like the idea is that they're this like new controversial thing that like hasn't existed, which is not true. These studies have been done for decades and decades by experienced researchers around the world, and actually have been responsible for a lot of therapeutics and vaccines that exist right now. I think markedly for malaria vaccine, which was recently approved, which is really exciting to see. And also the cholera vaccine, which was only approved after doing a phase 1 and a human challenge trial. So going back to this idea of there's a solution that we want to exist in the world, and the solution is how do we use these mechanisms to make better countermeasures and to better prepare for ourselves for pandemics. And I think it's like easier said than done. I think the text has moved a little bit in the slide transition, but I think it's like easier said than done because when you first start out with this kind of like target or objective that you have, you're thinking about, okay, so these are the people it impacts, or these are the funders, or like these are the people that I think I should get on board from the government. But it is like a really, really complicated map. I think human challenge trials are this like really niche mechanism in the overall solution for clinical trials and kind of like how do you develop countermeasures. But even within that, there are so many actors involved, as we kind of like learned the good way or the hard way, so to speak. And they range all the way from what did the government agencies think? What does the general public think? Because I think you could set up a challenge trial, but if general public is not interested in volunteering for one, it's kind of redundant. Then you have sort of like think tanks in the UK, which influence government agendas and what the policymakers or decision makers are thinking. I think the funders here on this map are really like a huge contributor to all of this. And this ranged from national funding agencies to larger bodies like the CEPI or the Wellcome Trust, which fund some of the biggest pipeline for vaccines or therapeutics in the world right now. And there's some of the collaborators that we engage or work with in this process. There is, of course, the academics. For us, this has markedly been people in University of Oxford, Imperial, at least for the UK, who have been kind of these experts who have challenge study experience for decades and decades. And then you kind of have people from health officials, so people who actually help run the clinical trials or monitor or regulate them. And then also industry, I think, is again, a really big player in this, because private industry has a lot of power, not just capital, but I think like influence to kind of really manage the map of where the solution is heading. And I think that when you're thinking about where do you start with making change, or what is the change that you want to see, like it's really, really helpful to kind of take stock of where do you think you are in this whole process. So at the end of this path, you have your target, the solution you're trying to get to. And I think the flag here is supposed to represent that as far as solution making is concerned, where do you actually sit as this kind of like broader third-party individual trying to enact change? And I think as a small project or a new sort of like EA or non-EA organization who's thinking about this as well, your resources are going to be pretty limited in the beginning. Everything from the capital to team members to kind of like the operational infrastructure. So you have to be very, very cutthroat to kind of like where do you spend these resources, and then what is sort of the highest impact path to focus on. So I think doing this like analysis of forget what you think you know, what do actually people who are in charge of making decisions think is super, super important. And I think for us that one of the reasons we decided that we want UK to be the first country in the world to really pioneer what mechanisms like human challenge studies are is because in 2021, during sort of the COVID period, UK became the world's like first and only country to run a COVID challenge trial, which was huge in kind of like how these mechanisms have been used sort of like throughout history. This trial was led by Imperial College London in the UK, and following that, University of Oxford have also started follow-up trials to kind of test this using a Delta variant. So there's been a lot of good follow-up to this study, and I think when we started this campaign, we were really excited that, UK has this amazing legacy for the kind of scientific capability to work on this. So it should be pretty easy to convince a lot of the people involved in this process, since they already, paid for this study and did it. We could not be more wrong. When we actually sat down with a lot of the decision makers here, there was actually a lot of frustration from their part, because despite of what we think or don't think, for them it was like, well, we spent millions setting up the study. The study started in 2021, and the first vaccine was already in the market. They were like, what the hell? What was the actual point of doing this? Which is a fair question to ask, regardless of like how biased we may or may not be. And I think like operating with that question was a pretty difficult starting point in reality to what we had imagined for challenge trials in the UK. And I think a lot of our first few months of that work was really spent trying to first just like get a meeting with a lot of the important people. Like that in itself is a huge feat when you're kind of starting on this kind of like policy advocacy path. Second is like, if you manage to get these people in the room, then really like listening more than you're talking, and really kind of scoping out what their hesitations are, which in this case was like, well, they didn't contribute, they were really expensive. And then third is kind of like showing them that idea that this cannot be something we think in a linear path. I think in this case, like human challenge studies were seemingly redundant, which they were not, was because they didn't contribute to the first iteration of vaccines, but there was a very high probability that the first iterations could have failed, in which case this data would be very, very valuable. And I think the second part is we still don't have transmission blocking vaccines, as I said, which again makes this data very, very valuable and worthy investment. So I think that this third aspect is like really getting them to think beyond of where the reality is to where it could be. And that convincing can take some time, and there's a mechanism that I will touch on that. So yeah, like this kind of analysis path of doing a check of where we are and where we need to be is super important. And kind of like following what I was saying, I think another kind of blocker that we ran into in this process is challenge studies, as I said, is a mechanism that humans, or we as a civilization, been doing for like decades for endemic disease settings. So diseases like malaria or Zika, or kind of these like low middle income countries zones where they've been used to kind of accelerate how quickly we get to a vaccine and what the efficacy of that vaccine really is. Also, human challenge studies are significantly quicker and cheaper to run, which makes them kind of like a really attractive candidate for a lot of these settings as well. And then you have this sort of post-COVID pandemic prep / biosecurity realm that currently exists, which is exciting to see. It's exciting to see that it exists, but I think does come with a lot of notions for a lot of these policymakers who maybe have not had the opportunity or the time to kind of really sit down and analyze, okay, what are the different branches of pandemic preparedness and like where do these mechanisms fit? For them, it's really like, they don't have the time to read anything beyond like 2-pagers in most cases. So it's kind of like getting their attention. And I think the one problem we ran into here is like, there you have this thing, which is challenge studies, then you have this thing, pandemic preparedness. What we want is like a mixture of the both, because really in combination, they're a really, really powerful tool for civilizations and globally. And because these things exist in separate boxes for policymakers and decision makers, we were expending a lot of time and resources kind of like splitting ourselves between the two, which was not helpful to either or the overall goal. So really, we were much further back in our campaign or strategy than we thought we were. And first point that we needed to address here is like, how do we actually like get them to see that this is one and the same? Like, we're trying to get them to think that these are like two mechanisms in combination, which are like heading in the same direction and helping improve kind of the overall resilience that the global system has to biothreats. And that in itself was an interesting thing to do. One of the levers that I would say I learned over the past few months, which has been really helpful, is, this is gonna sound really basic, but sometimes basic is the most effective step, is kind of like getting the people in the same room via events or publications or a lot of the research that we've been working on. So we did this event back in April, I think it was, where we worked on a report we spent about 1.5 years working on. And this report was a collaboration between this huge sort of like landscape that I was showing earlier, so sort of the academics from University of Oxford, Imperial, UCL, all the way to like industry who actually run the challenge trials themselves, to government stakeholders who helped contribute to the report, to funders like Wellcome Trust and CEPI, like fairly senior leadership team from these institutions. And really this report was touching on broader areas of how do we like utilize mechanisms like challenge studies going forward? What are some of the ethics or the kind of the infrastructure bottlenecks we're operating with? And how do we solve them, what these frameworks could look like, which was in itself a really exciting piece of research since it like literally did not exist before. And this was kind of the launch event that we did to showcase that. In kind of like the top picture there, you can see some of the experts who worked on this report, but also kind of co-directed the AstraZeneca vaccine. You have representatives from Wellcome Trust on the further right, and kind of academics from Imperial in the middle. And just in the kind of the audience, will not see it here. We have basically a lot of the policymakers from relevant health departments in the UK sitting and kind of listening to the recommendations and what they mean, and just having this like, in a very basic form, like a 2-hour space to kind of like take in this knowledge, throw out their questions and hesitations, have them answered back, not from us, but like from these experts who kind of have this experience, which in itself, I think, was a really helpful strategy for us. And And we kind of complemented that, or try to like kind of reinforce these relationships a bit more with kind of like follow-up social events that we did. So we hosted we rented out this like really beautiful space at Welcome Collection and had our volunteers talk about their experience of being in a challenge trial. Our volunteer community for us has been like pretty huge. And I think some of the most effective work that our team does, or our organization does, is really like giving them the platform to share their experience, which I think can be super, super kind of helpful to share their stories, but also to showcase like what the end user of some of these mechanisms looks like. And then we also kind of hosted some informal dinners where we kind of like strategically tried to make, this is kind of trying to do like the Met Gala seating chart at some point, but we strategically tried to place a lot of the policymakers with some of the academics who were big supporters and kind of like pioneers for some of these mechanisms, with funders who would hopefully listen into this conversation and maybe be willing to open up their purses, which would be exciting. And I think that was a really helpful step for us. The second thing we also did here is earlier this year, UK had a big call for evidence related to strategies for pandemic preparedness, and we submitted a pretty substantial piece to that as well, which kind of like helped reinforce some of these things that I've been talking about, combining challenge studies and pandemics into kind of a one piece, which got picked up for us by POST, which is kind of Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology in the UK, who did like a follow-up article on this, which was really, really helpful, kind of like disseminating it into the right networks. But this piece in itself, I think, was like probably one of the least effective steps that we did in the overall campaign and overall strategy. And I think like we didn't expect everything to work, and this was a prime example that not everything will work. And I think like that's okay. Like it is, I think it is like your job to kind of go out and figure that for the thing that you're trying to enact, what are the pieces that are the most successful for the target audience you have in mind, and which ones don't work. We had really high hopes for this one, but I think in reflection was probably something that needed a lot of operational overhead to get this implemented. And I think, as I mentioned, as an organization who has limited resources, that's not always possible. So we decided this was a piece where we were going to kill. And taking stock of like where we are after all of this work in a few months, like happy to say, I think we've moved further along this path where we've managed to connect the pieces of challenge trials and pandemic preparedness into the same sentence for a lot of these decision makers who are analyzing this. And I think as we progress further, the next step for us really is, okay, so we've answered this question that these mechanisms can coexist and the resources we're spending should be spent in combination, but then like how do you actually like do that? How do we go from the state that we're in to the state that we want to be? And how much is it going to cost? This question about sort of like the cost analysis, I think EAs are like pretty good at doing that themselves as well. But I think for a lot of the decision makers and a lot of the policy makers, this is always going to be a concern. So I think a recommendation I do have is that for the interventions you think you're designing or how you're communicating, one way or another, you will always run into this question of like, well, how much is this going to cost the government? And it's really important that you've answered this early on. And the second tip I would have is like, it's really, really important that you communicate the fact that if you have initial infrastructure that you set up, that really helps kind of descale what the follow-up cost of that program or intervention is going to be. And I think that's a point that seems obvious in theory for some of these things, but is like not that apparent in kind of the discussions or hesitations that a lot of these decision makers have. So you should really try find systems and designs that help you echo that again and again. And I think like when we talk about this like solutions existing in interpandemic phase, where you have the initial investments and during the pandemic this pivot is fairly cheap, I think it's going to be super, super important to get that point across. Touching on sort of like where we're going from here on and what the next steps are, I think something that's been pretty effective for us in having these relationships being built with the right people, and when I say the right people, I mean people who probably have the most vested interests as a result of their profession or what they care about or the changes that they want to make in government. We've been able to build some pretty good relationships with them, which has been really helpful to get us from this like organization project that's like no one's heard about to, I would say, like somewhat outsider to insiderish perspective, where we just have like a way to get more accurate information about what is actually happening related to this decision in a more timely manner. And it's helpful that sometimes it is literally as unofficial as being able to send someone an email and hear back sort of like what is happening and what the next steps are going to be. So I think the kind of like the point we're at right now is we've answered how the two mechanisms connect. And the next step is like, how do you actually bring them into reality? And again, this is like a pretty complicated question, everything from sort of cost to infrastructure to the actual science of bringing this about. And some of the things that we've been doing since then is, back in June, we were able to kind of like utilize our strength as like this third player who can kind of like, because we're small, we can do things pretty quickly and pretty fast, which is helpful. And like make these bridges between different sectors and different people who like didn't even know the person existed or didn't know like that was possible. So that's really been like a superpower as far as like a third small group is concerned. And we convened this meeting back in June, I think it was, where we did sort of like an international cross-stakeholder meeting between the industry, the funders, the academics, and regulators. And we tried to kind of like scope out or draw out this question of like, okay, we've decided that we want these mechanisms to exist. What does like the use cases for these mechanisms look like? How do we fund them? What are the ethics we have to run into that we will need to solve? And then kind of like who's in charge and who's responsible for a lot of this work. And I think this was probably one of the few or one of the first times we were able to, as an agency, bring together groups that range from kind of like not just UK, but also decision makers in the US. Agencies like BARDA and NIH, they've been kind of like doing a lot of work on this, and maybe even push outside of just UK more into the US and sort of like international parameters to consider mechanisms that help improve a country's resilience to biothreats, which was pretty exciting for us to see. I may be inaccurate on this, but the last I heard, I think US are also looking more into what mechanisms like challenge trials are going to mean for them going forward. And we're hoping that rather than this campaign that we started out in the UK with the hope that at least like one sort of like scientific innovatory sort of country will follow, we're hoping that it has kind of like outpouring effects into Europe and US as well, and this kind of like synchronization between nations on how they think about pandemics, which should always be the case, by the way, given it's a biothreat. That would be very exciting for us to see. And the third thing that's like been really powerful and usually is like a pretty useful leverage tool in advocacy is building partnerships with institutions who've kind of like done the hard work of getting connected to the right individuals, have built a lot of sort of like legacy and credibility in this space. And it kind of outpours in two remits. One is that you as an individual or your team will learn some pretty valuable lessons from the partner. And then second is they will help build bridges or connect you with the right individuals that they have experience working in, which is a really like, connections in advocacy are like everything, I think, maybe at the same level or a little bit after money or funding for work, which is, yeah, super, super helpful tool. So the third thing that's been really helpful for us and something I guess we're trying to get off the ground now is partnership with institutions like Chatham House, which is one of the oldest and reputable think tanks in the UK, and RAND, which do a lot of like interesting work internationally for scoping these questions and kind of like scientific investigations generally, which I think would be a really exciting way to kind of bring these stakeholders again together and what the outcome there looks like. kind of doing like a last sanity check for where we think we are with this campaign, or generally the solution we're trying to work for. I think we've gotten to the point over the last seven months that we've been doing this work, where UK have like commissioned their own independent inquiry into what mechanisms like challenge trials will be for UK and how much investment they will make into this infrastructure. I think we're like halfway there, which is really exciting. And I think we're probably at a point if we just like take ourselves out of the equation and kind of like don't bother with it too much, this work will probably happen independently by itself. So we've got the ball rolling in the right direction. Now the question is like, do we even need to be involved anymore? And if the answer is yes, then like, how are we spending our time and like, what is the point of that? I think asking this question is like, am I still relevant, or like, do I still need to be involved, is pretty important question to ask in advocacy or like projects that you're working on in generally, because I think it's like easy to get caught in the details that, you know, you started a campaign, you did all this work, you expended all these resources, and you have this goal that you want to reach, but you're not there yet. And I think that's a pretty like tunnel vision view generally in advocacy, because then you're kind of ignoring all these actors that are already working on this or have started working on this as a result of your work, which are now pretty self-sufficient to do this for yourself. I think for you as like a small organization or a third party who has limited resources and attention, the question should then be, oh, what else could we be doing now? And I think like that's something that we did recently for us. This sanity check is, does our team need to be involved in this anymore? And what does being involved actually look like? I can't discuss the specifics too much, but happy to answer questions more in one-on-one about this. But I think the answer for us is like, we want to be involved. We've got the ball rolling in the right direction, which is exciting, but we just want to make sure it lands in the right goalpost, and it is not like a suboptimal version of the solution we end up with, but a rather pretty powerful one. And this is kind of like my last sort of like takeaway from this, that I think been like pretty helpful for me to reflect on as I was putting together this talk, but also generally lessons for how sort of smaller nonprofits are able to enact change on a large scale. I think first one, going back to my earlier slide, was you start out with a project or a policy idea, you think like you have some knowledge of where you think it should be based on the desk research or the interviews that you've done. But really, like, once you start getting out there and having these conversations with the actual decision makers involved in this policy, you should just kind of like forget what you know, or you think you know, and really give them the time and space to share, like, why is it that the fact that this solution, which apparently is very good for the world, doesn't already exist? Like, what are the bottlenecks? What are the hesitations? And really iterate your strategy and your messaging to tailor to that. That in itself will be really powerful for how many meetings you're able to get, how willing people are to listen to you, and really how relevant a lot of the suggestions you're making to the context or the country that you're operating in. And I think like one of the real powers of being this sort of like a policy outsider coming onto the scene is like you are able to fail quickly, which is really, really helpful as a learning lesson. You are able to do things probably on a faster scale than a lot of these sort of government institutions are, most of them. And you're able to build bridges between different points or departments within the government, which probably would not exist without your work, which is a really, really powerful tool to have. And I think a lot of the leverages that you're using in your strategy should build on this, because it can really help move things at scale for when you need it the most. So that'd be kind of like my sort of like last takeaway there. With that, just want to thank everyone for listening, and we can close the talk there.